Now, how can we facilitate the flow of this cycle? Well, first of all, we're going to see some pieces of news in GeneXus Server, which are a key code. There are improvements to simplify management and installing and maintenance. After upgrade 2 versus 15, it's possible to create a different instance than the one by default. Extensions are better performing and are easy to install in all IDE GeneXus. When we use a KB, using a pattern or using control, we need that extension to be available in the server, because they define new parts in existing objects, and so that they can go up to the server must know them. Now, if I had a GeneXus installation not using any object of the KB, and I would put up my KB on the server, I had it to install the extension to the server. At the same time, any instance of GeneXus downloading that needed the extension. Therefore, if on a KB you use the extension, it was necessary for all KB connected had the extension installed. Since 15 upgrade 3, the parts defined by extensions are marked as optional automatically, and they're only sent out to the server when strictly necessary. That is, you only have to have an extension installed in GeneXus if it is really going to be used in the KB you're using. If an extension is installed in GeneXus Server because any KB storing is using it, there may be other KBs not using it, and so no reference is added. Likewise, any GeneXus connected to the KB that don't need the extension needn't install it. And an IDE of GeneXus without the extension can also work with all the objects that are not using that extension, even if the other objects of KB do need it. Thus, we simplify a lot the fact of having a server with KB using different patterns, extensions, or user controls, and it isn't necessary for all IDE, GeneXus IDE share the same installations. Is that clear? Now we talk about GeneXus Server. That's a fundamental tool to simplify the integration of the code. Now, in fact, to be able to obtain DevOps flow, we must implement a continuous integration. Something new in this version is that we are now integrating GeneXus to Jenkins. We'll see how we can automate a basic case. That is, for instance, there is a change in the code and a bill is automatically triggered. We're going to go up to Jenkins, we're going to click on New Item, and we'll define a new project in Jenkins. Many of the things we're going to be seeing on the screens must be, the Jenkins must have plugins installed, but in the wiki you can find out how this is done. We have to define a new project, put a name to it if it's Bill, and we're going to choose the freestyle project option. We click on OK, and there we're going to edit the properties of our project. We are under description, we're going to write an update and a build of a trunk KB or development KB. And when we go to Code Manager, we're going to use GeneXus Server as our code repository. We're going to introduce the URL, the credentials. These are the credentials we're going to be using to connect to the server, and the KB name we want to connect to. If the rest is by default, we are basically working with the default version, that is the truck, and the default environment. We may have various GeneXus developments, and they will all be defined by Jenkins. Now, if we go to build triggers, we are going to see when we want this project to be run. We can choose poll as M. So we're going to ask poll to monitor the code repository every 5 minutes in this case. And in case it finds a new modification, that is a new commit, the build process is triggered. So here we're going to use GeneXus and the folder where the KB is. Please know that Jenkins installation is in the same computer as the one we have, GeneXus. And I want to add this because you see S colon, but it needn't be like that. Suppose we have a corporate KB and I want to go, to a module. Well, you may contact a KB. In the KB, you may contact an environment, but not a module. It's the entire KB. Are you thinking about doing it by modules? Well, yes. That division must be done in the KB itself. I mean, you could put that module on a separate KB, export it as an interface in binaries, and then on another KB that uses it, you may reference that module so that it receives the binaries and it's managing through the interface. What this is doing is automating a build of a KB. That is, modularizing and separate it in various components on the KB. You have to do it on the KB. This is automating on the basis of a KB. But you can choose on a KB if you have many versions, and in each one of those versions you have many environments, then you can define that you want to manage such and such a version, such and such an environment. She hasn't shown it because she said everything is by default, but there is a little button where it says advanced options where you can specify that type of thing, right? But anyway, it would be good so that I could choose some modules, because in general, in the ops process, in some cases, well, I would have all the entire repositories, but when there is something I need, for instance, I've got a case of a bank outside GeneXus, a bank that has several modules, and they do deploys twice a day, and so they would say, well, I want 500 programs, 200 programs, so they can't divide them. So it would be good. Well, yes, but what I meant is that it's not at this level that you make this partition. You can do it either at the code architecture and separate it in different KBs, or you can do it at deploy level or at build level. And so you can say, the Jenkins process is linked to a certain version or environment of the KB, but the build is only of this module or of the objects necessary for these objects. I said 2, but in fact there are 3. And you can partition at code level, you can partition at build level, or you can partition at deploy level. So when you make a deploy, you can say that although the entire KB has been set up, you can say that in this process, I'm going to deploy only these components to a certain place, or in these others to some other place. All right. Yeah, good. Right. So all the examples are on the default options. Those are the most basic, and if you've got any doubts, any questions, you can ask me.
Once again, we leave the version by default, and in the environment, we are going to put the one we're using. If we look at the additional options, we can see that at the moment of the build, we can choose rebuild all or not. There, we save, and with that, we conclude the creation of our first Jenkins project. This project, therefore, does the update from the server and then executes the build all from the KB. Now, let's see how we configure the second task or the second Jenkins project, which is the one that would do the deploy. That is to say, the one that would move the binaries generated in the KB to the test environment. This is also a very basic example. The only thing I'm going to be doing is calling the script, but definitely you can do more elevated things. So we're giving a simple example. So we have a new project called Deploy Trunk. Among the build options, we have the options to execute a bat command in Windows, and then we are going to configure that in the case of build, we want to execute a bat to a script. The script would be automating the necessary tasks in order to publish the binary generated in the test environment. We save through this option, and well, it's not only the binary, it's all the objects necessary for deploy. So we have the second task in the pipeline of the trunk development. This task publishes the binary generated in the build KB towards the test environment. If we have defined some unitary tests, we can define the third task in the pipeline that carries out these unitary tests. For this, we create a third Jenkins project that we are going to call trunk desk, and the description is run test in trunk. And now in the build option, we are going to select the option build to or solutions using build, because we have to do the test through an MS build. We have to execute all of the tests, but we are not going to enter into details about the configuration since we have all the documentation in the wiki. This is very fast. It's just giving you an idea of what can be done. We don't want you to leave here knowing everything on the basis of the video. It's in the wiki. So thus we define the three projects in Jenkins that represent each one of the tasks that we have to execute in our continuous integration process, where the last step is the execution of the unitary test that will allow us to validate the build. Now, how do we do in Jenkins to change these tasks so that the one is executed after the other? Another note, the deploy and the test don't need to come one after the other. They can be in parallel. Let's say that I do the test and not the deploy. If the result is not the one I want, you can say if the test fails, I don't do the deploy, but my test environment does not reflect the KB anymore. So finally, it's a decision about how you want to work. They are put one after the other, but they can be in parallel, or we can even change the order. The task is citizen build, and we come to the last sector, post-build actions. And there we are going to add the option build another project. Here we enter the name of the project that has to follow this one. After citizen build, we have trunk deploy, which updates the test environment. We can select the conditions to trigger these post-build actions. We could be just trigger if the build is stable, that is to say, if there were no problems when you did the build all or the update of the server. Then we execute the task that does the deploy, and we can execute the following step even if the build is unstable. We have now defined our three projects. How do we visualize them in a pipeline? For this, we go to Jenkins, and in the main page, we have the option of creating new views. When we create a new view, we put the name trunk pipeline. We select that it's a build pipeline view. We give it the name, and we select what's the first task to execute this pipeline. In our case, it's citizen build. This is a view of the pipeline of an existing project which has the same sequence of tasks that we have configured for our project, but the first step is called trunk update and not citizen build. Each line corresponds to an execution of the pipeline. Jenkins monitors the server every 5 minutes, and if it finds changes, it runs the pipeline. Each one of our three tasks in chain. Here we are seeing the story of the last build, the one on top and the previous one. Each one is a line, and downwards we have the previous one. In build 345 is the last commit. Then 344 is the previous commit 5 minutes ago. For each one of them, we can see the results in the output of the execution of the task. In the case of the build, we have the execution of the output of GeneXus, and in deploy we have the result of the script that is doing the publication. In the case of the tests, the output of the asserts, which maybe are difficult to see, but in the status we can see the test results and we see that our tests are running. We can even see the history of the tests, which shows in the various executions when there were errors and when not. My question refers to the control of the whole procedure. Is there any connections of Jenkins at any point with GeneXus version? I get version 1 and mark it as a version, or do I have to do everything in Jenkins? Well, there's no connection with GeneXus versions, but technically each run generates a build of your application, so you can do versions with that. There's nothing direct. What we are showing here is the standard process, but underneath what we are executing are MS build tasks, and there are some specific that have to do with the versions. For example, you can do commit or freeze versions, etc. You run the tests, and you can make the decisions where to deploy to another place. You can also decide to execute another step which will freeze a version or do a commit, that kind of thing. Well, that's why I asked, because you can implement a plugin that freezes at this point, and then afterwards in GeneXus I see the different versions and I see that they are updated. Yes, but you can do it with the MS build. Yes, you can call the MS build and specify exactly that kind of thing. This is always a balance. On the side of the MS build, it's the line of the lowest level, and there you have complete freedom to do whatever you want. On the side of the plugin, we want to leave the level of abstraction so that the most common things are easier. Some of them can also be incorporated in the plugin with some options. So there is a build step, which is to set a KB, and you can indicate that, but there can also be a build step that is to freeze a version or do an import, that kind of thing. It's something you can do, and in fact, the plugin itself is an open source code, so we believe that we want to collaborate and add things. Thanks. Yes, this pipeline is the pipeline of development. What you're seeing here is the pipeline with which we work at the company. The tests are executed in the KB that does the build in a separate environment that is connected to a local database, but actually those steps run in parallel. The deploy towards the test environment, which is a separate server, and this unitary, but in our release pipeline, by the end, when we go to production, for example, we freeze the version and we update a KB that we always have with the view code. So the complexity of the pipeline will depend also on your business and your process. But you have a lot of flexibility about things to implement. So, question. What's the reorg after the process? Well, the reorg is running from the KB, and it's the same answer to that I gave to the versions. In our release pipeline, what we have is a step that captures this organization and puts it in our folder so that we know that from then on we have to execute the reorgs. And there, too, it depends on the tools that you handle. The only thing that Jenkins does is to orchestrate things, to organize them. In fact, we could take the program of the reorg, for example, and do different things. We run again the pipeline, we press on the run button, and without waiting for 5 minutes, in this case, it does a new run. Here we can see when Jenkins is executing, the task is in yellow, and while the task has not been executed, it's in blue. Something else we can see, thanks to the integration between GeneXus and Jenkins, is that when we look at the details of the project of the update, we can see what other commits that are associated, and we can see the information about who did the commit and the inscription. If we look at the details of the commit, we can see the objects that were modified and that were included in the build process. So far, we have seen how GeneXus Server and Jenkins allow us to execute the first instances of this DevOps cycle in continuous integration. The release phase implies a decision with regard to the work methodology and release of versions, and there's documentation in our wiki. We will possibly have another continuous integration pipeline in Jenkins that will update the various steps and also the step to production. It's important to point out that not all steps in Jenkins need to be executed automatically one after the other. Maybe our processes are not ready to go into production. Several stages are required, so we can indicate whether the tasks are going to be triggered automatically or manually. We can execute the release pipeline for the publishing of a QA environment and leave the pipeline until the test team gives us the okay to continue progressing. As we reviewed the DevOps cycle, we saw the changes between version 15 and 16. Good. Do you have any questions?
¿Cuáles son el tipo de fallas que...
What are the kind of errors or failures you could find when these processes are executed? You showed a slide in which you showed procedure 1, procedure 2 that went well. What is the kind of failure that could happen on the side of GeneXus? Each one of the tasks have to solve whether the end was successful or not. In the case of GeneXus build, there's a failure, for example, when the reorg fails or the compilation is not correct, etc. It doesn't capture anything functional. For this purpose, you have a stage in which you run the tests. But in the building of the KB, those are the possible failures. For example, it cannot update the server because there is a conflict somewhere. It cannot do the reorg. It doesn't specify. It doesn't compilate. Last question. There are tools that capture the generation of the application, in this case Jenkins, but there's a tool that is complementary, for example, for the follow-up of the tickets to see what's happened. In this case, it says, well, I have 20 tickets and I can assign them to different people. When do you intend to include any of these and with which product? Well, we have it in the radar. It's part of the things that we talked about. Yeah, I'm going to stand at the front. I'll speak from here. Yes, in the speech about platforms, I said that the line we are following is that GeneXus Server should be a server in the largest sense. Initially, it focuses on SSM, versions, traceability, teamwork, etc. But we intend to add more features. One of the things we're doing is with Jenkins, for example, integrate in a sense, that is to say that Jenkins can know what GeneXus is and what GeneXus Server is. That's a plugin in Jenkins, and you can say this is a GeneXus KB, do a build, or this is connected to a GeneXus server, do an update, and this is seen as something native, as we did with cruise control earlier. The idea is to integrate it in the other sense, that is that from GeneXus Server it can be connected with processes like this one, such as Jenkins. So you're always going to have the possibility of going to Jenkins and do the configuration manually, but the idea is to offer it also from the side of GeneXus Server, so that in console of GeneXus Server, so maybe in GeneXus IDE, you can say, I want to define a process on the KB with such conditions, etc. And as we talked about integration with Jenkins, we can integrate also with other tools. For example, for code review, we've been working with Fabricator, doing some tests, and for the tracking, there are other tools too. Fabricator has issue tracking, right? There are many tools, and all of them have extensibility mechanisms and plugins that allow the connection of one thing to the other. For example, Fabricator with Jenkins, Jenkins with Fabrication and GeneXus, etc. So once again, we always have two channels. Firstly, that there are components, even if they are low-level components, but that they allow for all of the power, that they don't stop anyone. And secondly, that you don't need all of the complexity, and that we can offer the things that are used more frequently with a higher level and more easily. Well, I don't know whether I got lost somewhere, but usually you speak about GX Server. What if I don't have it? Well, the GX Server will orchestrate all these things. Now, maybe you will have a license, or you will hire some components and not others. It's not that you have to have a GX Server for everything. For us, technically, GX Server orchestrates everything. Maybe you have the component that does build automatically or the continuous integration, and you don't have the one that manages the visual tracking or code review. But we are talking from a technical point of view. Commercially, how it's going to be fractioned and commercialized, I'm still not sure. But indeed, all of these things are not defined by us. The fact that you have to have GeneXus Server in the sense of SSM version code, yes, it's a practice in the industry. You have to use a code repository, and you have to use different versions and commit. What we do is give the tool for this purpose, but yes, of course, you need it.